Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Zhou in Beijing. 80 years ago, the Communist Party of China declared the successful completion of the Long March, a two-year adventure of great daring in which the Red Army of the CPC evaded the pursuit of the nationalists and trudged over 12,500 kilometers on foot to reach its final destination in northwestern China. But that part of the history, however, was mostly unknown to most Westerners until 1984, when Harrison Salisbury, Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times correspondent, retraced the entire length of the Long March. And later, based on his interview with survivors and research in provincial archives, he movingly described the experiences of the men and women who endured the most difficult conditions of this march in his book, The Long March, The Untold Story. Accompanying Salisbury in his two-month journey into the past was translator and interpreter Zhang Yuanyuan. Well, Mr. Zhang is also former Chinese ambassador to Belgium. To learn more about the story behind Salisbury's book and the Long March, we're pleased to be joined today by Ambassador Zhang himself in our studio. But before we get started, let's take a look at this.
In October 1934, in order to break the siege of the Kuomintang forces and continue the fight against Japanese aggressors, the Chinese workers and peasants' Red Army soldiers left their bases in southeast China's Jiangxi province, embarking on an odyssey later known as the Long March. The route passed through some of the most difficult terrain of western China by travelling west, then north to Shanxi. It was an extremely tough journey. The Red Army soldiers, wearing shoes made from grass, marched through raging rivers, snowy mountains and arid grassland. Apart from the ordeal of hunger, thirst and cold, they had to deal with airstrikes and fight against hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers who were after them every day. In October 1936, the Red Army soldiers successfully completed their odyssey on foot. Before they reached their final destination in Shanxi, the soldiers had trudged over 10,000 kilometres, some of them even 12,500 kilometres, the distance from Beijing to London. The number of surviving soldiers was less than 7,000, down from 86,000 at the start of the Long March. The Long March was soon reported in Red Star Over China, a book written by American journalist Edgar Snow. But no book had ever been published in the West to tell the full story until 1984, when another American journalist retraced its route. Harrison Evans Salisbury, former New York Times correspondent and Pulitzer Prize winner, received permission from the Chinese government in 1983 to travel along the march route. The journey took place in 1984, and the result is the publication of The Long March, The Untold Story. It's an epic story of human struggle told with the insightful reporting of a Western journalist. Accompanying Salisbury in his two-month-long march were Charlotte Salisbury, his wife, John Service, a former US diplomat, General Qin Xinghan of the Military Museum, and Zhang Yuanyuan, his interpreter and translator on the journey.
So today's topic is about the Long March, which happened 80 years ago, the trek of some communist troops. It is known to the Western world by a Western journalist, Harrison Salisbury. Let me start with you, Mr. Zhang, Ambassador. Why did Salisbury choose to take the journey in 1984, and why in 1984?
That's a very good question. You know that Harrison Salisbury was not the first Western correspondent to write about Long March. The first Western correspondent who tells stories about Long March was Edgar Snow, who went to northern Shanxi in 1936, where he met with Mao, Zhou Enlai, and many Long March veterans.
Before the communists took power.
Before, yes. However, he said that he didn't have enough time to record the entire history of Long March. Certainly, at that time, the 4th Front Army, the 2nd Front Army had not arrived in northern Shanxi. So Mr. Snow was not able to meet all the party and the military veterans involved in the Long March. So he wrote something like, someday someone, I hope, will write a more complete account of this great odyssey. And Snow and Salisbury met all like overseas correspondents in their job to cover World War II. They must have talked about the Long March. Later, Salisbury told me that he somehow believed that if Edgar Snow did not write about it, I would be the one that will shoulder this job.
And did it understand what kind of a journey it was and what it must take to write a book on this topic?
I don't think he did. Actually, he was not, as an American correspondent, of the mainstream American correspondent. Harrison Salisbury was not able to travel to New China for many years. The first trip he made to China was in 1972, after President Nixon's visit to China. During that visit, he raised this subject of writing a book on the Long March with Premier Zhou Enlai. And Zhou Enlai looked at him, showing a smile. Harrison later described as the Mona Lisa's smile. Because
but no definite response.
No definite response. And Salisbury later said, I was too naive, too ignorant to know that the Long March in 1972 was a no-no subject. It was during the Cultural Revolution. Many of the Red Army Long Marchers were either in prison or subject to persecution.
Actually, China was a mess.
Exactly. But he was very insistent. He kept raising that subject to the Chinese side repeatedly during the next 10 years, 12 years. Later, a lot of changes took place in China, the smash of Canada 4, the start of reform and opening up. And so in 1983, finally, news came. Someone from the embassy asked him, do you still want to go on that Long March? And Salisbury later told me that he was thrilled. Of course, I will be going.
You worked not only as a translator for the book, The Long March, Untold Story, you also accompanied him during the journey.
Yes.
What kind of experience was that?
Well, in the beginning, he arrived in Beijing on March the 1st and stayed there for a month, during which a lot of interviews took place. And I was among many interpreters assigned to these jobs of interpreting for these interviews. But after a while, he believed that he needed to have a short list of interpreters instead of having one interpreter, different interpreter for another interview. He wanted to have one single interpreter to do that job. And I was selected, but not selected without a rather tough screening process by him.
How did he choose you?
Well, he had this the famous specialist, or called the Jack Service. Everybody knows that Jack Service is a Chinese specialist, very well versed in Chinese language, Chinese customs, and he was literally hired by Salisbury to be his consultant, to be his advisor. So when Jack Service arrived, he was also sitting in these interviews, and he was asked to check me on my performance of accuracy. Essentially is accuracy.
What is the most important quality he was seeking from an interpreter? Is it language proficiency? Is it well-versed in Chinese culture? Is it good rapport between him and the interpreter?
I think he's a little bit suspicious at the beginning, because he is going to ask a lot of tough questions to the Chinese.
Yes.
Questions that will be regarded as even
offensive,
even rather like a provocation. So he is very free. He doesn't know any Chinese, so he didn't want his toughness sort of evaporate or disappear during the translation, lost in translation. He didn't want that. So he wanted all the ingredients there to be translated.
So he wanted a faithful interpreter.
Exactly.
And how did you do the job?
Well, I did just as a professional translator or interpreter. We have been trained to do that, to do the job that way. And Jack Service approved my performance, and he told Harrison that this is an interpreter that will help you.
How long does it take for him to finish the journey? What kind of a experience was that? Because he was 76 years old, a lot of a road trip, boat trip, different kind of trip through difficult terrains. What is the most difficult part of it?
Well, it's a very difficult part of it. Above all, he's old, 76, and he also has a very hard condition. He has a pacemaker planted his chest, and his wife is 70, also quite.
Also with him throughout the
traveling
journey.
with him, and Jack Service is 75. So 3 elderly Americans going on this very difficult
And
trip.
how many Chinese staff are with them?
Well, this gentleman, General Chin, who used to be the president or the director of the military museum, and I myself. 3 foreigners and 2 Chinese.
Just 5 of you.
5 of us, starting from Beijing. Well, the whole trip or the whole project in Beijing, in China, lasted about 109 days. From the time they arrived in China and the time they left back for America, 9 days, during which he spent 63 days, 63 days in provincials, in the provincial areas. The rest are in Beijing, meeting top officials and experts.
How did he choose his itinerary and the people that he would want to talk about? What kind of subjects, what kind of stories he was looking for?
In retrospect, I believe he had already had the whole story or the whole book structured, somewhat
Before
structured.
he descended on the journey.
He had already
A lot of research.
a lot of information at hand. The reason he must take this trip, he must ask all these questions in all these interviews, is to testify whether these information are correct or incorrect, whether they're false or true. And because a lot of this information have come from other sources, from Western sources.
Give me one example that he testified as true or as false.
I don't have specific examples to that because it's all in his mind. He asked questions and he would check against the information he's got with the new information we provided. Sometimes he would argue with us fiercely, He has a very quick temper, hot temper. He said, well, this is not true. For example.
You convinced him it is.
No. I just relay. I'm a translator. I just relay what our experts told us.
Okay.
This is what happened in history. Like, for example, like how the Red Army, the First Front Army, marched, the formation, the position of each army groups. Well, he somehow had an idea that was the formation. We later told him that was not true. This is the formation we believe that actually took place.
So he went to very detailed information
Very detailed. If you have,
about how the troops marched.
yes, if you have read the book, you would notice that this is a book that is full of details. So it's just like a picture. It's just not just the sketches of human images. It has all these details.
I presume that Ms. Salisbury did a lot of research before he came to China to write about the Long March. But I also believe the experience in China, more than 100 days, must have changed his perception about China in some way. What are the differences this experience has made on his mind about China?
He has become more admirer of the Chinese common foot soldiers in the Red Army. Because we did not just arrange top leaders to meet him. We arranged small soldiers, small officers, or just people, common folks who actually saw the Red Army, who hosted the Red Army officials in their homes. It's just common folks. From all these stories, little by little, I believe he developed a strong admiration for the common soldiers. So he devoted his book to the Chinese men and women in the Red Army. He didn't say that devote his book to Chairman Mao or Premier Zhou or all these top leaders, the Chinese women and men in the Red Army. So the common Chinese, poor peasants who later become soldiers, who serve in the Red Army, I think that has become a source of inspiration to him.
All right. And today we've been talking about the Long March and a book on this, and of course the interpreter for the book and the translator for the book, The Long March, The Untold Story. Don't go away, we'll be right back. According to our knowledge, Ambassador, the journey was very taxing and challenging on his body, on his mind. I was told that Salisbury had a heart attack once. Did he ever think of quitting the journey? What was his state of mind and state of body during the journey?
Well, there was a lot of concern about his physical conditions by the Chinese and by the Americans. Salisbury's wife, Charlotte, was most concerned about that. Actually, she fought for a long time against this trip, but finally he joined the trip, became a very good helping hand. He did have not a heart attack, but a serious heart problem. Especially after the trip to the Jiaopingdu area, because there was no road. We had to walk or ride.
We have to remember, in the 1980s, the transportation in China was very substandard, I should say.
Yes, yes. Actually, some say that the features of the areas along the Long March remain pretty much the same.
Even 40 years?
Even 40, 50 years after the Long March took place. Because a lot of Chinese development have taken place in the recent 30 years.
Yes, since 1980.
Yes. So he lost a lot of moisture, a lot of water, and his heart started to beat irregularly.
But did he ever consider quitting?
Well, he actually told me, that morning, I arrived in his room and he said, "John, I'm finished. I'm dying. The Long March is finished." So he was very disheartened, very distressful. And of course, we gave him some help, medical help, but it was so remote an area. The medical facilities were very much substandard. So finally we arrived in Chengdu, where a more thorough checkup took place, and also consultation with his American doctor through the long-distance phone. So finally, we all arrived at a conclusion, especially they arrived at a conclusion that he's fully recovered and he can take the trip, resume the trip. So after some 10 days of an interval, our Long March project restarted.
But did he tell you anything about the book on the journey? Did he tell you what stories he would focus on, what kind of themes that he would project through the book?
No.
No.
I think that probably be a confidential subject matter. I wasn't allowed to ask about that. My professional training asked me not to ask questions like that. But we can, from the day-to-day work, we can pretty much tell that what kind of book he's going to write about, what kind of stories he's going to include in his book.
When the Foreign Ministry was talking with him about writing a book, did they say anything about exercise of control over the contents of the book?
No. I think this is one of the things that that I'm very proud about. You know, after the book is translated and published in China, and Salisbury must have somebody who checked with the Chinese translation, and he was shocked. I use the word. He was shocked that a lot of the segments, a lot of these chapters that he thought would have been withdrawn or forgotten by the
Chinese editors,
stay there. We didn't do any sort of a revising or editing, so the complete of the book will be affected.
So how has the book been received, both here in China and overseas?
So far as I can tell, this book is very well received because it's the untold story, or if some of the stories are known already, but has never been told the way Salisbury put it. He used a lot of stories we have already known, because he used a lot of materials from the published Chinese books, reminiscence, articles, so on. However, the way he put it, with the emphasis he put it, gave us a lot of thought, or food for thought. After the book is published, after many Chinese Long March students read about it, I think there's a new leaf turned for the research of the Long March itself. So after this book, I've seen a lot of Chinese books written by Chinese army or other writers who are consciously or unconsciously following the style of Harrison Salisbury.
And have you sensed any difference of perspective? As you said, perspective is important from Western readers and Chinese readers about that chapter of history.
Well, yes, of course. Many people read about this book. Every time I raise this subject, they say, "Oh yes, I read that book. It's a very good book. Oh, I didn't know that the Red Army was so capable of doing all these things." The whole book is very positive about the Red Army. However, if you read the book, you will find that in the final couple of chapters, Salisbury had a lot of very strong criticism of the Chinese policies or Chairman Mao's policies during the Cultural Revolution and so on. That's his interpretation. Though all these judgmentals are his. He said that I am alone should be responsible for all these conclusions. However, I think overall, this book presented a very positive image of the Chinese Revolution.
But do you think Salisbury has been truthful to history, at least what he understands about history? Because we know that Harrison Salisbury has been working in Moscow, he's been traveling to Vietnam, is critical of the Vietnam War, and he has been coming to China a lot. What kind of influence his thinking, his philosophy, his values is any bearing on this book?
First, he said something like that. He said that in childhood, as well as in great parts of the adulthood, China is his holy land, like a Mecca to a Muslim. I don't know what that means, but anyway, he wanted to be in China, wanted to see China for himself. He wasn't allowed to do that because he was an American journalist.
So do you think he deliberately glorified China because he considered this place a sacred place?
No, if you read the book, you know that he's not a full sympathizer of the Chinese Revolution like Mr. Snow is. He's considered as a liberal. He is a supporter of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, you know that, freedom of speech. And above all, in his own words, he's a troublemaker to the bigs, to the strong and powerful and all these big authorities, whether it's American government or Vietnamese government or whatever government. He wanted, if he wants to criticize somebody, he just go ahead criticize it.
So in the final analysis, what do you think is his take on the Long March spirit? Is it different from what we Chinese understanding about the Long March?
And I think his interpretation of the Long March spirit is parallel to our interpretation of the Long March spirit. I think our interpretation of the Long March spirit is still a little bit narrow. And Salisbury, being a Westerner, being trained and and also covering the world events all these years, he had a rather global outlook or cosmopolitan approach. He sees the Long March spirit as the Chinese spirit, as a spirit that will bring China from a rather weak and vulnerable position to a strong and more powerful position. Actually, he believed the Long March spirit will inspire this country of more than 1 billion people to a very bright future. In fact, the whole epoch, a whole era will be characterized by that emerging China or rising China.
All right.
So he wrote about that.
All right. Thank you very much, Ambassador Zhang.
Thank you
so much. So the Long March 80 years ago is not only a migration of human body, it's a journey of human spirit. And in that sense, the essence of Long March will stay with us forever. Thanks for watching Dialogue. I'm Joe in Beijing. Goodbye for now.